grew up in the 90s, I had a front row seat for the debut of Spawn and his ongoing adventures and burgeoning universe. With Image being the new kid on the block when it came to producing comic books, it felt very exciting, like anything was possible with its characters. And for many years, Spawn was the flagship title. And naturally enough, over the course of the first 2 or 3 years, Spawn faced a litany of villains who had come to make up his defining rogues gallery, and amongst them was Cy-Gor, the cybernetic gorilla. Across the years, this character's had various updates and he's evolved visually, but this is how I remember him in his very earliest appearances, and he hasn't really strayed too far from this across all the years. And of course, throughout the years there have been a number of toys based on this character, but today I'm really pleased to be able to say that I have hold of the 7-inch scale version of this character from MacFarlane Toys. Now, when I say 7-inch scale, I mean he's in line, he's in scale with the 7-inch figures in this line. The figure itself is obviously significantly taller, and as you can see, he comes in this oversized packaging. Now, anyone who's familiar with this line or bought other figures in this line so far, you'll know what to expect from the branding and the packaging design. It is quite plain, there's not an awful lot to it. It is mostly window display with the figure in all his glory there. And then there is the Spawn logo and just the name of the character. The rest of it is just black paneling. So the design is fairly simple, a little bit bland, but it is clean and crisp, and when you have such a fantastically large figure like this, it's always going to be very presentable and quite displayable. I do really love how they've used the side panel to use a classic image of the character here. I think this looks absolutely fantastic. It's a very striking visual image, looks glorious, and I think this is fantastic. If you want to put this on its side on the shelf, it looks really, really good. So top marks for this. Meanwhile, the reverse of the packaging has a photo stock image of the figure itself with a warehouse photo behind him. So this looks pretty cool, again, pretty presentable. I do like the use of the purple colouring, the filter there, which just gives it a little bit more colour, a bit more life, and I think this looks really good. The interior inlay in which the figure rests against is a sort of yellowy, fiery, sparky kind of background. It's not quite defined what it is, but it's very colourful, it's very striking when you put the figure in front of it. You'll also notice there is a very small stand. This is a standard stand that comes with a lot of the 7-inch figures. It seems ridiculously small for this particular figure and fairly useless in truth, but I suppose it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. Now, of course, the first thing you're going to notice when you liberate this figure from the packaging is its size. This is a big figure. This is a mega figure for sure. Now, interestingly though, he's fairly light. He's not as heavy or as dense as, say, the Violator figure that we just got from this same series. Now, as you would expect, the sculpting is pretty excellent, I have to say. There's an awful lot of detailing here. I think the head sculpt in particular is really, really impressive and has certainly caught the spirit of the character. Now, you may notice that the actual design with that headpiece, the sort of metal headpiece that we can see there, is a little bit different to the original interpretation of the character. But as I said, the character has evolved in terms of its look and design across the years, but this is still close enough in spirit to what I think of as Cy-Gor to adequately fit into my collection. And in truth, having that metal plate on one side of the head just adds even more interest and detail to this head sculpt and the sculpt in general. And we can see here that on one side we have the deep cut scars running through the head there. Again, very beautifully painted. The paint apps are magnificent. I really love the snarling mouth as well with the teeth and the tongue. I think this looks really, really good. And as you would hope, a lot of detail here, and it's been capitalized on with a fantastic paint wash. And again, we can see that attention to detail, that love and care have gone in both into the sculpt and into the paint apps right the way throughout this figure. And there isn't a part of this figure that doesn't have some point of interest on it, because it feels like every part of this figure is a canvas to really create a very stark and impressive visual, so that no matter how you pose this figure or what kind of display you put him in, he's always going to look really visually interesting and draw the eye because there's so much to him. Nothing on this figure is recycled, whether it's the various sutures and cuts and bruises to the more technical aspects with the various wires. We have different coloured wires, we have so many rivets and grooves and bits and pieces running throughout this figure, and it's all very beautifully painted with that fantastic wash running through it, so it looks used, dirty, battered, and just looks very authentic, very real, which is wonderful. And this continues all the way down to the feet, which is brilliant stuff. Now, the one thing I did want to point out, though, is that you will notice in the groin area, in that crotch, that he does have this rubber piece. And that is because it needs to be flexible enough to be able to accommodate all the various articulation that we see at this point in the figure, but also to try and hide that articulation and make it look fairly seamless and smooth. So it's a really good idea. However, it just seems a little bit too big, a little bit too loose, and so it does resemble a sort of giant nappy, which is a little bit disappointing and a bit strange. So moving on to articulation, he does have a ball joint in the head, so he can move his head from side to side and he can roll it forwards and backwards as well. However, there is a major hindrance to this articulation by that big shoulder piece, which is a hard plastic and there's no giving it. So it is limited how far you can move this head, but nevertheless there is still a fairly decent range of motion here, which is great. Now you'll notice that on this shoulder in particular, he's got this extra piece here. Thankfully that is a soft rubber, so it will move with the ball joint, which is excellent, and that arm can lift up and out a pretty good distance. I wouldn't say it's huge, but it is certainly enough for this figure. It works pretty well. Now he also has a pin swivel at the elbow, so he can move his lower arm from side to side and he can hinge it to about 90 degrees as well. There's another pin swivel at the wrist, so again he can spin that wrist 360 degrees, and of course he can hinge it forwards and backwards, which is really good. However, I was really disappointed to find that the fingers, despite being really huge, have zero articulation, so they are permanently in that mould. You can do nothing else with them, which is a real shame, and I'm not quite sure why they did that. He does have another ball joint at the waist, which is fantastic, so he can move from side to side, forwards, backwards, he can lean from side to side. There's a huge range of motion here, which is absolutely brilliant. Now he's got ball joints in the legs, so he can kick his legs out to the side, a really healthy distance there. He can also kick them forwards and backwards a good distance as well, which is great to see. And he's got a hinge at the knee, which bends to about 90 degrees, which is pretty successful, actually works quite well surprisingly. He's then also got some articulation in the ankle as well. So that means the foot can hinge forwards and backwards, just about. It's not a huge range of motion, but it's certainly enough to do the job. And of course it will spin from side to side a little bit as well. So the big question is, how does he scale against Spawn? Well, here he is against the Mortal Kombat Spawn that was released a couple of years ago and sort of kickstarted this line in its own way. As you can see, Cy-Gor absolutely towers above Spawn. In terms of the actual size of this figure, I'm guessing he's probably pushing 10 inches rather than 7, clearly. There's a huge size difference both in breadth and height, and this is entirely appropriate. This looks very nicely scaled. This looks pretty accurate to what we see in the comic books, and I think they've done a very nice job of this. This looks great when you put them next to each other. For those who are curious how he measures up against the previous MegaFig, which of course was the Violator, here we can see that actually the Violator has a lot more height. He can actually be a lot taller, given that he has the extra joints in the legs there that can give him more height or less, depending on how you want to pose him. But if you want to stretch him out fully, then he's a little bit taller than Cy-Gor actually, which is surprising. And he's also a lot heavier, a lot chunkier. He feels a lot more robust as well, and he has a lot more articulation actually, I have to say. Of the two figures, for me personally, I think the Violator is the absolute standout, but Cy-Gor is a good runner-up. I think this he certainly looks the part. He looks pretty cool when you put them next to each other like this. And for a point of reference, here are all three next to each other. So as you can see, Spawn clearly has his hands full with these villains, and that's the way it should be. This looks really cool to me. I think this scaling is very, very nice and very impressive. And yeah, it's already building up to be a pretty fantastic collection of figures, actually, I have to say. So then, final thoughts. Well, for me, I think this would be a 4-star figure. Certainly, there's a lot of fantastic qualities to this toy. I think he's really nicely scaled, which is fantastic. He is wonderfully oversized, which I'm very much in favour of. I think the detailing and the paint apps are magnificent. I think they've really captured this character and done a very nice job with him. His articulation, for the most part, is really very nice. There's an awful lot you can do with him, put him in various different poses. I think he's quite dynamic because of that, so you can have different different displays with him, which is wonderful. But that said, there are some limitations to it, like the arms don't go out quite as far as I might like. Certainly the head is very restricted by that big shoulder piece that he has, which is disappointing, and I'm really very disappointed by the fact that the fingers in the hand cannot move at all. Given that they're so big, I would have thought there would have been at least been a point of articulation at the knuckles, say, or perhaps they could have given an option to just give him alternate hands, but we didn't get that. There are no accessories with this figure at all, which is a shame, all things considered. I also find that rubber piece in the crotch area to be very distracting. It looks a little bit sloppy and just feels a little misjudged in hindsight. There's also something a little disconcerting about how light this figure is. It's very noticeable when you put him side by side with the Violator, just how heavy and chunky that figure was. There's a real sense of quality to the Violator that doesn't feel present in Cy-Gor because he feels so light. There's a certain cheapness attached to it, and yet it is a very nice looking figure. You'd never know it when you to look at the figure when you put it on display. It looks just as good as the Violator, but when you have it in your hands, it just feels a lot cheaper, which is a shame, but overall, it doesn't impact the aesthetic of the figure. After all, this still looks absolutely fantastic when you put it on display. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.